My name is Grant Szuveges, and this is a fourth video for Moonee Valley Libraries. The video we're going to look at today, the game we're going to look at today, is a fairly interesting game. It's a little bit longer than the games we've looked at in some of the other videos, but nonetheless very interesting. It's a game where I play against a player who's weaker than me, but still a reasonable player. And some of the moves my opponent played are fairly instructive mistakes. So we're going to have a look at why those moves were played and what was wrong with them and how you play against them. So let's get started. In the games we've looked at so far, White's played e4 in all of those games. In the centre, controlling the centre with a pawn, opening lines for the bishop and the queen. In this game, though, I actually opened with d4, the queen's pawn. Now, this is also a good move. In the centre, controlling squares, and just like e4, opens lines for pieces. So it opens a line for the bishop, etc. And my opponent now played his knight to f6. Knight f6, good move. And that stops me from playing e4. A more common move at lower levels is when black simply plays d5. And that's just like e4, e5, d4, d5. And if black had played that, the move I would have played was c4. And that's a famous opening called the Queen's Gambit. But my opponent didn't play d5, my opponent played knight f6. I can't play e4 because my opponent will take the pawn on e4, so I played c4. Very normal move for strong players after they play d4. Opens a line for the queen. My opponent played e6, and I played my knight out to c3. Okay, and I'm threatening to push that pawn to e4. If I can get that move in, my position's very good because my opponent can't capture because I can recapture with my knight. So my opponent doesn't allow this. He plays bishop to b4. And there's a name for this opening. It's called the Nimzo Indian defense. So a little bit of history. About 150 years ago, and that's not a hard and fast number, people would play against d4, people would always play d5, stronger players. And the Queen's Gambit was almost compulsory when d4 was played. But then in the 1920s, along came a guy, one of the strongest players in the world, called Aaron Nimzovich. And Nimzovich contributed something very important to the theory of chess. He contributed the idea that you can control the centre from the edge of the board. And he created a defence. He created a lot of things, but one of them was this defence, the Nimzo Indian defence, whereby he hasn't actually put a pawn in the centre, but by playing this bishop move, it pins the knight. So it means that white can't control the centre, because if I just play e4 now, black has a very easy move. Black captures this pawn. And see, white can't recapture because that would be walking into a check because of the pin on the knight. So a very good idea from Nimzovich. And this opening is still played to this day by top level players. I play this opening myself with black. It's a very good opening. Okay, so what does white do? There's a number of things white can do. I played e3, which is considered the best move in the position by most of the world's strongest players. And now, and again, black can play a number of different things here. Black can castle here. Black can play c5. Black can play d5. The move black played, though, was knight to e4. And what he's doing here is attacking the pinned knight. So he's pinned the knight with the bishop, and he's now attacking it with his knight. So attack the pinned piece. We talked about a pin in the tactical toolbox. When you pin your opponent, attack that piece with other pieces. So he's threatening to take my knight, and if I take back with a pawn, he'll take again with the bishop. So I need another defender. I used my queen, I moved it to c2, defending the knight. So if he takes my knight, which he does, I can recapture with my pawn, sorry, and then the queen will defend that pawn. The other point with queen c2, not only does it defend the knight, it actually attacks my opponent's knight. And so here my opponent captured my knight, but I think he captured the knight the wrong way. Probably the best thing to do for black is to take the knight with the bishop. I take back with the pawn, and I have to because I'm in check. Then he could push f5, protecting his knight in the center, or he could push d5, also protecting his knight in the center. Now, the other option he's got is to simply play d5 straight away, or f5 straight away, just protect the knight. Instead, though, what he did, he took the knight, but he took it the wrong way. He captured with his knight. Now, his knight's in the center, therefore surely it's stronger than my knight, which is pinned. I mean, this can't move anywhere because it's pinned. And he's trading his strong knight off for my weaker knight. So I didn't think this was a good move. He captured, and I recaptured with my pawn. And now his bishop is forced to move. He moved it away, he moved it to e7. And now I was able to continue my advance in the center. So he's neglected his center. And if your opponent doesn't control the center, you should control the center yourself. So I pushed my pawn up to e4. I have a very big center now. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns in the center. My opponent now, what did he do now? That's right, he castled now. So 1, 2, rook on the other side. Okay, and now I developed a piece. Now normally you'd develop a knight before a bishop, but in this situation I developed my bishop first. I won't go into too much detail on that because I'm pitching this to a beginner's class. What I will say is develops the bishop into the center, sensible move. So bishop out to d3. The reason was I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do with the knight yet. My opponent now moved his bishop to g5, and the reason he played this is he's intending to try to trade bishops in this position. Now, he could have traded it off earlier on over here, but he's missed that chance. So bishop g5, offering bishop takes bishop, queen takes bishop. And I thought, no, I don't want to trade them like that. I've got more space, so I want to squash my opponent. When you've got more space, don't trade pieces, push your opponent further back. When you've got less space, that's when you should trade pieces. So I avoided the trade and I played f4, attacking his bishop. Now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pawns in the center. He moved. I thought he might move his bishop all the way back here to e7, but he threw in another move. He played his bishop to h4 check. All right, so how do we get out of this check? Do we run away with our king? No, not at all. We block the check with a pawn, and at the same time, force the bishop back. So I get asked all the time, what's the difference between a strong player and an average player? A strong player will play moves that do more than one thing at once. This does more than one thing. Blocks the check, so it gets out of the check, and it drives the bishop away. Bishop moved all the way back to e7. Okay, back to e7 it goes, and now I can control even more of the center. And my move here, I pushed my pawn to e5. So taking further control of the center, but this unleashes something. This is now a discovered attack on this h7 pawn. Now, remember when we put the bishop here, we've got a battery. Queen protects bishop, bishop protects queen, a queen and bishop battery. And by pushing e5, we're unleashing an attack, a discovered attack on this h7 pawn. So it was our move here. We could take the pawn with a check. And you'd see black could not capture that bishop because the queen would be protecting it. So black has to defend against this. How should black defend? Probably the best defense for black would be to move the pawn up one square. Now I could give the check, but that's not an issue for black. Black just walks out with the king, so that's only a check. The move that black did play, I thought was slightly weaker than h6, but it wasn't, I don't think it was terrible. He played g6. Now, this blocks out the bishop. It blocks out the attack. The problem with g6, though, is that it makes it a lot easier for white to attack. So this pawn is something that's quite easy to latch onto. And I'm going to show you the technique in a couple of moves. Okay, this pawn, I'll tell you about that next move. All right, what do I do here? All right, I continue to develop. What haven't we developed? The knight. So the knight now comes out to f3. Sensible move, develop a piece. My opponent now plays his pawn to b6. And this move, Aaron Nimzovich would have loved this move. The idea is to control the center from the edge. So what he wants to do is put the bishop on b7, and then it's going to control an enormous big diagonal. Okay, controlling the center from the edge. And there's a name for this. It's called a fianchetto bishop. So you put the pawn on b6 or g6, but there's no bishop here. Put the bishop there into that spot on b7, a fianchetto bishop. It's called the hypermodern school of chess, controlling the center from the edge. This is what Nimzovich invented, this sort of thing. Okay, let's get back to white's position. Now, I said last move that we can attack this pawn, or we can latch onto this pawn. The way you latch onto a pawn like that is you push your h-pawn, h4, like this. Now, I've got a friend at Melbourne Chess Club who calls this move the can opener. He feels it's like pushing the pawn up like a can opener, latching onto the can, and then opening the position up. h4, h5, latch onto this just like a can opener latches onto a can of baked beans or a can of peaches or something. So h4, the can opener. All right, my opponent continued with his plan. He played bishop b7, putting his bishop on the long diagonal and controlling the center from the edge. As well as that, what else is he doing? He's attacking my knight. So I can't just give him a knight for nothing. I can't move the knight either because he's pinning the knight against my rook. So I've got to make a decision what to do here. Now, I've showed this position to quite a lot of people. Some people suggest rook to f1, but, well, that takes our rook off the h-file and it's not going to help the can opener very much. Another move people suggest quite a lot of the time is castles. So 1-2, rook on the other side. Well, it gets out of the pin, it defends the knight, but it misplaces the rook. I wanted the rook here. So the move I played, I actually used my king to defend the knight. I moved my king up to f2. It's unusual to do this in a game. You don't normally move your king voluntarily like this, but in this position my king's quite safe because black hasn't got anything anywhere near it that will be able to attack it. All right, what should black do here? Black should certainly consider pushing these pawns in the center, either c5 or d5, controlling the center at some point. Another move I thought might be quite useful for black is king g7, a really good defensive move. When you've got a fianchetto pawn position and you don't have the bishop there, get the king there because it can control these squares here. It makes it harder for your opponent to attack. It also means a rook can get to h8. That's a concept that I'd normally teach advanced players, so I won't talk too much about that. What I will say is I'll discuss the move that black did play, and I thought black's move here was a terrible move. So black's got this wonderful bishop, this absolute monster of a bishop controlling the long diagonal, and it's pinning my knight against the rook, so it's stopping my knight from moving. Now, a bishop's worth 3, and a knight's also worth 3, but that doesn't always mean that's an equal trade. If you look at this, yes, they're both worth 3, but this bishop is so much stronger than that knight. Yet my opponent traded them. He traded his monster bishop for my pinned knight, who won out of that trade. So obviously he took my knight and I recaptured with my king. And I think it's fair to say that that's a little win for white. White's managed to eliminate black's really strong bishop, and black's managed to eliminate my average knight. So that was a bad move on black's behalf, trading those pieces. His bishop was better than my knight. He should never have traded it. Okay, he now moved his queen to c8. I think what he wanted to do here was to bring the queen to b7 and check my king. And then once he checks, the king moves. So if his queen gets to here, that's check. King moves away, then he can win my rook. But I'm not worried about that, because if he does give that check, I can just block with my bishop. And that's actually attacking his queen. My bishop's defended with my queen and my king, so it's not an issue for me at all. Alright, so I wasn't worried about queen c8. So I continued with the can opener. I played h5. Okay, so opening up the h file. And here, my opponent had one move that he absolutely had to play. The move he absolutely had to play was king g7. This move would have kept him safe. If I capture the pawn at g6, he recaptures with his h-pawn. And he's okay, he's hanging on here. He didn't play king g7. And I think what happened here was that he didn't anticipate what I was doing. I'm sure that he saw pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. But I think he didn't see the next move. Okay, so the move he played was c5, attacking the centre. And now I was able to pounce. I played pawn takes pawn. And here, I think, I'm not totally sure, but here is where I think he noticed what I was up to. I suspect he originally intended to capture with his pawn. But if he did do that, I was going to sacrifice my bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Then if he takes the bishop, I recapture with my queen. And when I recapture with my queen, what do we have here? This is checkmate, because the king's in check. It can't go to any of these three squares because of the queen, and it can't go to this square because of the rook. So he would actually lose the game there. So I think what happened was he recognised my bishop sacrifice, but he recognised it one move too late. Now, this is unfortunate for him because he can't really go back from here. After I've captured that pawn, things are now not looking good. So he decided not to capture back. What he did, he played in the centre again, d5. So some people might argue that d5 should have happened on move 1, and I think they do have a point there. Definitely maybe by about move 6 or 7, he should have done either c5 or d5 in the centre. In this position, I thought, how do I go from here? My first thought was, should I just take the pawn? And I thought, well, if I take the pawn, I win a second pawn and I'm winning this game easily. But the problem for me was his king could actually hide behind my pawn and use my pawn as a shield. Now, I have no doubt I would have won this game anyway because I've got 2 extra pawns, one of which is on the 7th rank. But I thought to myself, well, I'll play that if I can't find anything better. But I am going to look to see if there is something better than this. So the next move I looked at pushing the pawn, giving it up. His king would take the pawn then, and then my rook could capture on h7 check. He can't capture the rook because the bishop protects it. The problem is he can move back to g8. And yeah, I'm still winning, but I haven't found a way to checkmate him. So I thought, all right, well, I can do that if I need to. I don't have to, but the option's there if I want to do it. I also looked at rook takes pawn straight away, but again, I didn't feel that did enough either. So I looked at this position for quite a while and I thought, why is it I can't find a checkmate here? How can I not be winning this more efficiently? And see, this is something that strong players go through as well. It's not just something beginners go through. I decided to think about it from another angle here. I thought, all right, well, I'm attacking with a bishop, I'm attacking with a rook, I'm attacking with a pawn, but these aren't my strongest pieces. What's my strongest piece? It's a queen. It's worth 9 points, isn't it? A rook's worth 5, a bishop's 3. I need my big, strong pieces to be doing this job. And when I realised, okay, I've got a queen, I need to use that, I found the move very, very quickly. What I did, I thought, let's get the queen into the most important part of the board. I moved the queen across to h2. You might notice now that I've got a battery with my queen and rook. Queen and rook battery, and this is devastating because the queen and rook want to go and helping each other. The queen wants to go and win that h7 pawn. So if I capture that pawn with my queen, that is checkmate. Because the king's in check, it can't go to either of these dark squares because of the queen. It can't take the queen because that'll be checked with a rook. Now, even if, after this move, even if he captures my pawn, with the f-pawn, for example, I capture here, and that's still checkmate. The rook protects the queen. This is how strong that battery is. And the same applies if he captures a pawn with this pawn. I can play the queen to h7, checkmate. Same checkmate. I could also play the queen to h8, which is checkmate as well. Because he can't take my queen because the rook protects it. He can't come here. The queen protects that. So my opponent saw all these problems and he decided he'll play a move to try to run away, try to run his king away. He could push the pawn up here, but I'll take the pawn and then it's the same situation. He's not getting out. I'm still playing checkmate on h8 or h7 the very next move. So the move he played, he ran his rook over to d8. And the idea of this move was once I take the pawn here, he'll run out this way. So what I did, I captured the pawn with my queen check. And as you can see, because the rook's moved away, his king now has some wriggle room. His king moved across to f8. And now, though, the unfortunate thing for black is I've actually got 2 checkmates I could choose. All right, so the one that I did choose, I chose queen up to h8, and that's checkmate. The king's in check, and it can't get out of check. It can't go to e8, that's still check. Can't go to g8, that's check. Can't go to g7, that's check. But there was another checkmate as well, and that's to move the queen across and capture the pawn on f7. And remember, in previous lectures, we've talked about how vulnerable the f7 square is. Once again, it's vulnerable here. The king's in check, can't move to e8, g8, or g7 because of the queen, and it can't capture the queen because that would be checked with a pawn. So we're using a queen and pawn battery here. So we finished this game off. We did this checkmate, but this one would be equally good. So a very instructive game. Black tried to control the centre from the edge, so playing hyper-modern chess. And he did okay, but he made a few mistakes. The main mistake, I thought, was trading that bishop for that knight, that monster bishop for the average knight. That was his biggest mistake, but a pretty instructive game nonetheless. Looking forward to our next lesson. See you next lecture.